Ooh, I've never been in here. Well, thank you. John came down and kind of read me the riot act, like, what the hell are you doing in my source code? And so, wow. Oh, tell me more, Mark. Tell me more. Maybe I wrote this when I was drunk or tired. Do you want to be fast or do you want to be secure? Pick any one. Hey, I'm Dave. Welcome to my shop. The one thing we couldn't establish is where the latency happens. Does it happen 20 seconds after I start clicking go live, or does it record for 20 seconds and then buffer and I sit here like a fool for 20 seconds? I don't really know. So either I'm going to look like a fool for 20 seconds on the intro, or I'm going to be cut off 20 seconds in. I don't know which. I'm here with Glenn, a friend from high school who's working as our moderator today. He's in the comments section. So if you've got questions, please jump into the comments section and fire away. How do I display the secret network info in Task Manager? Wow.
Task Manager, Performance, Ethernet, right-click.
All right. Task Manager. I'm going to bring this up. Let me see what happens. Sorry, I can't show you as I do it. Task Manager, Performance, Ethernet. Then what am I doing?
Right-click on Task Manager, Performance.
Yeah.
Ethernet, right-click, View Network Details.
Ooh, I've never been in here. Well, thank you. Maybe I wrote this when I was drunk or tired. No, I didn't write this. This is way newer than me.
In that order.
Yes. Let's see. This is pretty cool. So I'm not going to waste time by watching my screen while you people are listening. But yes, there is a new network details thing that I was not aware of. And it provides you all kinds of information like link speed, state, byte throughput, bytes sent per second, unicast, non-unicast. And it shows all your different Ethernet, Wi-Fi. So pretty handy. So to get there, right click on your Ethernet performance graph and then pick network details. When did I start using Linux? 1992, 93? I actually started with Minix, which was before Linux. And I forget if Minix, I don't think it was the same guy. So I think Linus started with the Minix code and then built Linux on top of Minix, or based on, I'm not a Linux historian, but long story short, I've been using it forever. I just didn't use it a lot in the 90s because I was working at Microsoft. So I used it when I was in college, excuse me. And those were the days when, just getting a thing to boot was amazing. If you actually set up your partition and get your PC to boot Linux, it was quite an accomplishment. And then by the time I graduated, I think Slackware was around as a distribution and Red Hat might have been around. And then I just didn't touch it until I retired. And then I've been using it ever since, especially since they added it as WSL and WSL2 especially. Love it. Would I consider doing a coding show with Mark Russinovich? I'd love to talk to Mark, but I would probably just sit there and go, Oh, tell me more, Mark. Tell me more, because Mark's a pretty clever guy when it comes to the operating system stuff. So I would spend most of my time trying to learn from Mark, I think.
Does Task Manager show all CPU loads and processes, or is there something running in the background which is not shown?
Nope, it should show every CPU cycle should be allocated there. Some of it will be system, and that's stuff actually done by the system, like rotating threads and that you have no control over, or stuff down in the device driver. And then there's user side, and it should total out to 100. Now, remember, your CPU can slow up and slow down and speed up. And Task Manager, I think, is always showing you the relative amount. So when it says you're at 50% usage, it might be because your CPU is just kind of idling right now and at 2 gigahertz. How they handle that right now, I'm not sure. Wasn't a concern in my day because CPUs didn't do that. So, how are we doing for questions, Glenn? Any killer questions come up yet?
Do you think IBM OS 2 is better OS than Windows?
Well, it's better than Windows 3.1, but I would not rate it better than NT, but certainly better than the Windows of the day, Windows 3.1 and Windows 95, because if nothing else, OS 2 had real memory protection and preemptive multitasking. It had the wrong kind of multiprocessing. It was like asymmetric or symmetric, the bad kind, where it's like you got one CPU dedicated to the OS and then one CPU dedicated to user programs, and they can run at the same time, but your tasks can't float around from one to the other. Maybe that changed. I'm not an OS 2 expert by any stretch. So I used Presentation Manager, and I wrote a little calculator program or a dialer program or something with buttons, and that's about the only thing I ever did in OS 2. And that was before my days at Microsoft. So
yeah, someone else is asking about any artwork you did in Microsoft.
The only famous artwork that I have are the little tray icons for Task Manager, the ones that if you go in there, you can see it starts with 1 pixel of green and you get to 100%, it peaks up. That little tray icon, I drew a set of 10, I guess, because it goes 10%, 20%, so on. up to 100%. And I did those in 94, and they've never changed them. I'm not saying they can't be improved on. They do have some shading in there. There's some artistic sensibility in there, but that is really my only art that I ever contributed. Oh, that and the old meters in like the XP Task Manager, the green graph, and now they're like light blue on white, so they're a little fancier, but the original drawing of the graphs was all mine too, I think, because I always wanted them to look that way.
Jacques wants to know how is Rust compiled with C in the new makeup of the Linux kernel? Yep.
Beats the hell out of me. I'm just starting to learn Rust myself. So in terms of, I mean, it's pretty easy to link with C, but I'm not the guy to ask about Rust.
What about Microsoft storage spaces? On how to repair it?
No, I don't know how to repair it. I'd start over. I'd probably use something else. I set up my own RAID here at home, and the first thing I did was set it up using disk management, the old one, because that's what I used when I was working on NT. And I mentioned this in like a Facebook Cardboard Junkies group, and they were like, "You're a fool, man. They haven't maintained or updated that thing in 10 or 15 years." And I'm like, "Oh, yeah, so I probably don't want a bunch of storage bugs." So I switched to storage spaces, and that is what I'm running on my main PC right now. But when I tried to set up my Storinator with it, we hit a 63 terabyte hard limit on the size of a pool, or was on the size of a volume on a pool, whichever. But the machine's like 420 terabytes, so 63 wasn't going to work. So I wound up having to use TrueNAS, which is fine. It's a good system too. But the Windows storage spaces works pretty well for smaller volumes. And what I've got going on is 3 SSDs in RAID. They're like gigabyte Aorus SSDs, and they do about 3,500 megabytes a second each, and joined they did 10.3, so just over 10 gigabytes a second. So it's almost linear, so it tells me that the Windows storage spaces is doing it pretty efficiently. It must be reading from all hardware devices at the same time and everything else you would hope. So seems to work well. It's just limited in size, and that size limitation may only be in Pro for all I know, because I'm running Pro. Maybe if you've got workstation or server, it's unlimited. You'd have to check the web.
I was asking about how your production configuration's working on the 45 drive server.
Good. So what I wound up doing was, if you didn't see the last episode, I kind of drew a diagram of it, but I have 3 VDEVs of 10 drives, no, 3 VDEVs of 9 drives each in RAID Z3. So 2 of the drives effectively are going to be dedicated to parity, and that means 27 drives are active across those 3 sets. They're striped, so you get the read speed of all 3 at once. And then I have 27 drives, and I have 30 total, so I have 3 left over as a hot spare. And it's working well. I'm not trusting anything to it yet. I'm backing everything up to it, and then eventually I will deploy it live and then back it up to the old 12-bay NAS and to the other smaller NAS, and I have to split it up. But time machine backups, I don't know if I need to back up time machine backups again, but I might.
Not polished DE. Have you tried KDE Neon and Ubuntu?
The only one I've looked at that I thought looked really cool was Mint, I think. Has a pretty nice UI on top of it. And part of that's going to be familiarity, but I wasn't familiar with the Mac, and I looked at the Mac, and I'm like, hey, it's pretty, it's awesome. So if somebody came along with a UI for Linux that was, say, comparable to the Mac, and that's going to be a tough achievement, because they put a lot of money into trying to make the Mac work well. And say for Windows 95, I mean, you wouldn't think that there's necessarily not Windows 95, current Windows, sorry. They do a ton of usability and customer insight research and stuff to try to figure out what it is people need and so forth, and balance that with having to stick you in the old internet time property page when you're 8 levels deep in a menu. So, there are tensions both ways. The Mac is actually a little nice, because they'll just punch you and say, get a new Mac. And Windows, they can't do that. So,
how much of that program work as far as like how the menus are designed and the wording, and how much information you sort of provide for those functions?
Today, I would assume is a full design. When I wrote something like Task Manager, I just did it how I wanted to do it. And then I'm sure program managers would come in and contribute and say, no, you got to move this here, that kind of thing. But in those days, programmers would work with program managers and the designers to lay things out. So if you were dealing with the Explorer and the menus there that are really in everybody's face all the time, there's going to be a lot of scrutiny over those. But if you're doing the mappy property pages and there's an optional button with a cascade menu coming down, that's probably the programmer came up with that one. In terms of the wording in that, everything is completely flexible because it all has to be localized. So you'll do it in English, but you'll do it as indirected through a file called the resource file. So you'll have a C file, and it would never say hello world. It would say load the string with the ID of hello, and then print that string. And then in that other file, there would be, hey, for English, that string is hello. For French, it's bonjour. And for whatever else language, it's whatever. And so these days they can ship multiple languages in a language or multiple language packs in a system, so you can actually switch. Which, as a tangential story, is one thing I think I prohibited was running the Chinese language pack on English Windows if it wasn't activated. Because we didn't want, there's certain countries, Brazil, Russia, India, China, where they don't really pay for a lot of software. And so if they want to pirate it, you didn't want to get the full version and then just slap a language pack on it, because it was easy to pirate the English version, is what I'm saying. Easier, because it was volume.
Well, here we go. Win2000 days. What was the benefit of everything being an MMC snap-in? And why were third-party snap-ins so buggy and prone to crashing?
Well, why people had bugs, I don't know. Probably because it wasn't that they had bugs and they were prone to crashing, but when they did, it brought down the entire MMC. That's like if you write a crappy shell extension and it brings down the entire Explorer, that's a lot more annoying than just crashing your own little utility. So that's why shell extensions were problematic for a long time. Why was everything an MMC extension? Probably instead of having, we had Event Viewer and Registry Editor, and there was all these separate tools, and I'm sure they wanted to unify them. And there was probably the ability to remotely manage. So an MMC Snapin, I assume, I don't really know that much about them, but I assume you can generally get them from a remote machine too, which would mean that if you rewrote everything as an MMC Snapin, you could entirely administer a machine right down to the device manager from another machine, which I don't know if you can do that yet, but it sounds handy. So.
And again, everyone wants to know what you think about pretty much every operating system out there.
Well, we can try, but I don't use that many except Windows, Mac, and Linux. So.
Someone's asking, what do you think about Pop OS and their Cosmic Desktop? Is that even...
Pop OS and the Cosmic Desktop? I don't know. Yeah. I don't get out much. It's like, what was I watching this morning? There was some amazing new way for designing web pages, and I hadn't heard of the acronym yet. So I'm still trying to keep track of acronyms because they come and go. I mean, I've been around for a long time, and some stuff sticks and some stuff doesn't. So you got to figure out where you're going to invest your time. Rust, I'm going to learn, and Python I learned, things like that.
What are your thoughts on Windows authentication systems and things like Mimikatz? Would the Windows auth mechanisms benefit from an overhaul? I think
well, when I worked on Windows, you had to enter a password and a username. So that's what I know about authentication. So yeah, and it's technical questions about Windows, it's got to be about when I was there, because I haven't worked there in almost 20 years. So what they're doing now and why they're doing it, you're probably a better authority on it than I am, to be honest. So.
Did you have strict standards on commenting your code when you worked at Microsoft?
That changed while I was there. It used to be a complete free-for-all Wild West, and I remember there was one line of code that was well over like 160 columns. Like, normally you try to wrap everything within 80 or whatever, but this one C expression went on for like 2 screens, and then somebody would add a comment to it like, what the F is going on with this? Were you insane and drunk when you wrote this? And then there would be this whole comment thread. And then, they'd ship the source code off to a partner to review the source code, and they'd see all this nonsense in there. So we had to, before we could do that, we had to do a huge pass through the code to scrub all profanity, and then translate, where if somebody said, bug, this will probably crash if you ever enter 13, well, somebody's got to take that out of the source code and say that in the RAID database, there is a bug in that file that if you enter a 13 and prioritize it and scale it in terms of severity and stuff like that. Because just commenting your bugs is not a great way to keep track of them unless you're working by yourself or with this really small team. So we weren't formalized. We didn't have comment templates that we used or anything like that. It was strictly what your personal style was and following the style of the file that you're working in and the project you're working in. And I can't stress that enough because I got in trouble for that, initially, which was when I went in and started making changes in User 32, I did it in the Cairo coding style. Well, they're completely different, apparently. And so John came down and kind of read me the riot act, like, what the hell are you doing in my source code? And so I refixed everything to look exactly like the code around it, and then we were cool.
Again, this means nothing to me. What are your thoughts on the move to limit writing stuff to ring 0 versus the old way?
I don't know what the move is or the old way, but I mean, the less stuff that can be written to run in ring 0, the better, for sure, because the circumstances are the same for code that runs in ring 0 as in ring 1. The same bugs apply and everything else. But when they manifest in ring 0, it can be, incredibly serious. So You just get everybody out of there. I mean, printer drivers used to have to run and ring 0 and things like that. So fortunately, they got that out, and that's years ago. But video drivers are something that could be moved out. And in the original, you may not know this, but in the original version of NT, video drivers did not run in the kernel. There was a kernel stub side, and then there was a user side, and I think there was a thread paired on each side. And I'm not an expert on this architecture either, but the bulk of the driver ran in user mode, so that if your video driver crashed, your system would recycle the video driver and keep going. But if your NVIDIA driver crashes today, you're looking at a pretty hard blue screen. So that's a performance trade-off. Do you want to be fast or do you want to be secure? Pick any one. It's kind of that thing.
Oh, someone's made a claim here there's a bug or oversight in Task Manager.
Uh-oh.
It doesn't show handles as RAM consumed. It says he said apps run away with unclosed handles.
Yeah, but that doesn't use RAM.
Megs, but it actually consumed gigabytes, it says, and only showed consuming megs. But
I don't know, but if you use a handle, you're going to get the handle allocated to you, and there'll be memory allocated to your process on the kernel side to keep track of the resource that is referenced by the handle. But I don't think that opening a handle leaks memory by itself, if that's what the implication is. Certainly, Task Manager is just the messenger, is what I'm going to say here, is that if it's asking the operating system says there's this much memory free and there's this many handles outstanding, that's what I got to report.
Oh, there's your favorite adult beverage and your favorite sports team.
Uh-oh.
That's pretty obvious.
Favorite adult beverage? We'll go with Bud Light. Yeah. And favorite sports team, I guess, is going to be the Seahawks, although I barely know anybody on the damn team now because they're not rebuilding, but there's nobody around. How did MS back up Windows when you were there? Was there an offsite backup in case of a fire? Yes. So our dev machines were not backed up. Mine was, because I had a MIPS machine and I needed to save my code. And so I wanted to make sure there was a copy of everything I was working on other than the source tree, because you didn't check in all the time. So I got my dev machine backed up by ITG, which was, what did ITG say? Internal Technology Group, something like that. Network guys, IT. And other than that, your machine wasn't backed up. But of course, the source servers were where everybody contributed to. Those were backed up frequently, nightly at least. And then those were backed up somewhere to a building on campus. And then even at that time, there were multiple data centers. So, I mean, it would be in at least 3 buildings by the end of the day. And I don't know that any project ever lost source code, but I do know that there was one that I'm not going to out them, but they had to reassemble the code from the dev machines. So I believe the source server died or something like that happened, or somebody nuked it, probably human error of some kind, destroyed the source server, and rather than going to an old backup, they just reassembled it from everybody's current checked out versions, and that worked. I know there's also a case, and I don't want to out them either, Excel, but they had to ship the debug version, I think, and that's just a rumor, I don't know that. But I heard there was some team that had to ship the debug version of their code because once they took out all the asserts and everything else, the code didn't run anymore, which is a good lesson to learn, that your retail and your debug code paths should be identical. They can assert information and check and all that, but they shouldn't do different things. How are we doing?
Any fun ESP32 hacks you'd like to share?
ESP32 hacks. Well, unfortunately, if I lift it up, it'll just short out and everything else, but I'll be back in 3 seconds. Hang on. Yeah, I know. Probably everybody left when I wasn't back in 3 seconds. So I made this circuit board with the help from a guy in Sri Lanka. Hello, circuit board. So this plugs into the back of an ESP32 driven matrix, and this plugs into the back of a 64 by 32 matrix. Then it has an ESP32 with a rover chip and 8 megs of PS RAM, and it's got a microphone, and it's got audio input, and it's got an IR control output input, power for the matrix. So basically, you plug it in, and it turns a matrix into a cool information panel, and it all runs on the ESP32. And it's all using the Night Driver source code. And what I did was I took a project that I'd written years ago called Mesmerizer that ran on one of these panels, and then I merged it with the Night Driver source code by making Night Driver compile either way to work with either strips or with panels, and unified all the effects and the underlying graphics classes and everything else. So I've checked that in, but it's in my own private tree, so I got to merge that into the main Night Driver tree yet. But hopefully I was going to do that with the board release. The board's not working, of course. So I had to ship a couple of these boards by DHL off to Sri Lanka last week, which cost me $163 to ship 2 of these things. And he's going to take a look at it, see if he can figure out why. And I want to do some moves too. Like if you look at this board, I've got the audio coming out the top, and I need it to come out the side and stuff like that. So minor stuff. But that's my big news in the ESP32 world.
And Cairo was a precursor to Win95?
So Cairo was the new, improved, better Windows NT. It had like a relational file system, a relational database file system, and it had a new user interface they were working on, and so on. And now the problem was, well, after Win95, what user interface are we going to use? The new Win95 user interface or Cairo? And the standard answer was Cairo. And then at some point, I was talking to a guy, and he was working on the user interface running on NT that we're trying to get it to work, the Win95 user interface. And that was Bob, and so I talked to Bob, and I convinced Bob to let me join his team, and then so me and a couple other guys and a girl, and we ported the Win95 user interface over to NT, and then at that point they decided to kill the Cairo interface, which some holes were punched in walls, and people were understandably upset because their hard work and sweat and tears had just been obviated by a decision made by somebody else. And so, but today it's all unified, and now you have the old Win95 interface running on Windows 11 effectively. So, and it's, I think I've talked about this a bit in the past, but there are huge changes between Win95 and Windows NT, even though, you know, they're both Win32 and so on. But of course, the APIs aren't fully compatible, and things aren't the same. There's no reinitialized critical section on one versus the other, and one is ANSI, one is Unicode. And that's the biggest problem, because anytime you persist data, two things had to happen. When you're doing it on NT, first of all, you had to persist the full 30 or 16-bit Unicode, because you could have Arabic or Japanese or whatever text in there. And you also have to write an English version of it so that when that file is loaded on Windows 95, it just doesn't see the other stuff. So you're pushing it at the end of the file. And I worked on a briefcase, and there's some scary hacks in there. I shouldn't call them scary hacks. There's some very careful engineering to make sure that it can still work on a Win95 machine when you take that briefcase floppy, but when you bring it back to NT, it's not corrupted. All the 16-bit Unicode data is still there. And it was a lot of hoops to jump through to get that all to work. So,
Dave, are you interested in 3D printing, which just makes me giggle because of the problem we had with that printer?
well, I just retired my 2 printers after making this. So this is all I've ever made, and it took me 6 months to make that. So I got what are they called? Oh, they're yellow. I can't even see the brand on them, but they are a resin printer. And what brand are those? No, they're up on the top shelf over there now.
Oh, yeah. Anycubic?
Yeah, Anycubic Mono. And so, not the shaft Anycubic, but I had a hell of a time trying to get the deck height to work with the tray, and I had to cheat, and I had a piece of paper and an extra 3/1000ths for some, or 3/10,000ths of an inch for some reason. I learned this all online and on the forums and stuff, and so it was all helpful, but it's not like this thing worked out of the box. So then I got this to work, and I was quite happy. And then I tried to print something else, and it wouldn't read the file. And the problem is, well, you need to update your firmware. Couldn't update the firmware. Contacted them, they said you have to delete everything, and I was just like, no, I want a more reliable printer. I want the printer where I load a 3D model, and I click go, and there's a big spool of black stuff, and then I come back in 3 hours or 3 days or whatever amount of time it is, and it's just there. And it doesn't fail every time. I don't have to hold its hand. Because I've had really old hot feed printers, whatever you call them, and then I've had the newer resin printers, and I'm not impressed with either. So I would love a good printer. So if somebody knows a good one that's reliable and works, let me know.
What's the weirdest bug you've ever discovered?
The weirdest bug. One of the most annoying bugs I ever had to fix was I was writing a game in 6502 for the Commodore 64 in the 1980s. And this probably was painful because I was young, but I had a piece of code that for some reason would crash. And I didn't have an in-circuit debugger or anything in those days, so you would be doing effectively the printf debugging without a terminal, so setting colors and stuff like set your border color to the value of this hex address so you can debug what's going on. It's kind of that level. And long story short, no matter what I did, all these values would get corrupted and change to 0, and I had no idea why. And after about a week of debugging, it turned out that the level that was being reloaded in between the track screen and the gameplay was too long, and it was wrapping around the end of address space and coming up and trashing 0 page, which then indirected where it was writing, and it would start writing in the middle of memory. And it took a long time to sort that out without any kind of debugging tools. So,
How much effort goes into providing backwards compatibility to Win API?
well, lots as far as I know. I'm not maintaining any Win APIs, but as far as I know, they try not to break anything because you need almost all apps to work carry forward. There is a tier, there's probably the top 500 apps or top 1,000 apps. This was in my day anyway. And they would make sure the top N apps worked. And if there was an exception because the app was really horribly written, they would do their best to make it work. And I shouldn't say horribly written, but there are apps you can imagine like Adobe TypeScript Manager and for Windows 3 that added fonts and the ability to draw scalable fonts. Well, I think it hooked like everything in the graphic subsystem and then redid it. And then they expected that to work on Win95, which is a completely different system. And just going from version to version on the operating system took huge amounts of work to keep things completely backwards compatible because people didn't write necessarily to public APIs all the time. So if they only wrote the Win API, they would just have to never break Win API and you'd be fine. But people didn't write that way. So
how much effort do you put on, in case something impossible happens?
I put a ton of that time in. I had a lot of asserts. I had a lot of that kind of code. And again, you only assert the impossible, not the unfortunate. I do add a lot of logging of the unfortunate at the warning level. And so I had a lot of logging at 4 levels, verbose, warning, information, and debug. And then I had a lot of asserts. This is my ESP32 code, not so much my Windows code. But yeah, generally I'm pretty defensive because on Windows, it's very easy, I think, to get used to the environment of Visual C. And so when you're in Visual Studio, you can just write code, and if it crashes in the debugger, oh yeah, that's what I meant to say. But if you're writing for the ESP32 and you've got to flash it and burn it and go in and load it and boot it and hook it up and hope it works, it's kind of like the old days of punch cards almost. You're going to be much more careful, I think, than where you can just bang it out in the editor really quickly.
What about so do you think software technology is always lagged behind hardware technology? And is that gap changing?
I think it used to be the other way around. I think the hardware was way behind before the software, and the software was really too demanding of the hardware. And now we've had this inversion where CPUs and the number of cores available make CPUs just incredibly powerful, and we're not really leveraging the ability that they provide. And so software needs to catch up now, I think. And I don't think hardware is going to get that much faster. I mean, it will, but each core is not going to get that much faster independently. So a lot less reliance on single-threaded workflows, that kind of thing. Like if you run Photoshop now, the Photoshop benchmark does not scale MP very well because everything is on, not everything, but a lot of it is on the main thread. And for benchmarks, that sucks. Now for real work, as long as it's fast and responsive, that's all I care. But I guess you can argue that both ways. Photoshop, that all that matters is the single critical path anyway. Unless you're doing a bunch of batch processing.
If you were to develop a piece of old hardware with the software, what sort of hardware would you make? Sort of retro stuff, I guess. I guess that's what you're doing with the Altair and stuff too.
Yeah, unfortunately, all the hardware stuff that I've got, like the Altair and the MSI and the PETs and even the Apple II, it's all well supported. So the one thing I was working on is I'd like to take a C64 and basically make a virtual drive for it, kind of like an SD to PET. But I want to use the ESP32's Wi-Fi to be able to mount it remotely so that I can change what's on the disk image over the network. I think that would be really handy. But then again, I don't use my Commodore 64 much, but it would be cool. So that's kind of what I was thinking of working on. But
so what else are your thoughts on developers becoming so dependent on writing in managed code versus unmanaged?
Probably a good thing, although somebody's got to be able to debug the low-level stuff. They'll wheel Grandpa out every now and then to debug the heat manager. But I think probably Rust, and I'm new to Rust, as I've said about 8 times this video, but the fact that it does not have a heat manager but has protected memory, I think, is really what makes that one unique. And otherwise, I'm pretty cool with garbage collection. I mean, for things that aren't deep in the OS, I wouldn't write my file system in managed code necessarily because, hey, it just blocked to go do a garbage collection. But when you can do your user app and imagine you've got 16 cores, oh, I've got to do a garbage collection. Well, you can do that in another core. You've probably got a couple cores sitting around doing nothing anyway, so why not have them go do garbage collection? And that was not the case many years ago. You look at BASIC on a Commodore or something, you can come up with degenerate cases where the machine goes away for a minute and does garbage collection and then comes back, and you can't have that in real world. So,
What about, so someone's asking about if were you doing any test-driven development? And with the limited development tools available back then, what tools are available today that you wish you had back then?
What tools? See, I was always an early adopter of all the Visual Studio stuff. Everybody else was using the NTSD debugger and i386KD, and even on the MIPS, I would go through the whatever pain it took to get Visual Studio up and source level debugging. And you could argue that, hey, now my NTSD skills are kind of weak because I spend a lot of time in Visual Studio, but I always maintained that having people with different tool sets was handy, so I could find stuff really quickly, oftentimes, and fix, 10 bugs, and it would take somebody with the NTSD much longer to fix any one of those bugs, but they could also fix a harder set of bugs that I would not be able to address, and so then I would have to bust out NTSD, and I would be rustier at it. I mean, I know guys who would write macros and extensions and all kinds of stuff for NTSD, and I could only watch because I know how to use it, but I wasn't writing NTSD debugger extensions at that point or anything, because I was spending my time in Visual Studio.
And so I said, what do you think about the gradual hiding of control panel behind the new settings app?
I am okay with that as long as they provide all the functionality that used to be there. So what really chokes me is when they go, oh, here's the new time applet. Well, where do I set my internet time? You don't. And then they add internet time. Well, where do I put in my own IP if I want to specify a manual server? How do I sync now? How do I, and there's all kinds of stuff that used to be in the low-level API, and I'm probably picking a bad example. Internet time's not that complicated, but network properties. So when everything is moved to the new UI and they don't lose stuff and they do a new good job of organizing it in the current paradigm, I think it's a great thing. When they get 3/4 of the way there and they have to punch you to the old UI, that's kind of a rough experience, I think. I understand why it happens. It's just not ideal from a user perspective.
What are your thoughts on the modern C++ with auto lambdas and so on? Has it made it less readable or more challenging?
I think it gives you the ability to write some really horrifically unreadable code. So, especially lambdas and stuff, they can be really cool, but anytime something can be really cool, it can also be really dangerous. So, there's stuff you can do in C. You can make your code really nonsense with function pointers and all kinds of stuff, but you don't have to do that. So when using a lambda function, please write it as clearly and obvious as you can, and with nice indentation. And being too clever, never good.
Is your Pioneer RT909 repaired yet?
No, I got the belt for it. So I've got a Pioneer RT909 reel-to-reel, and I've got the smaller one too, whatever that is, 626. I can't remember. But unfortunately, it stopped one day, and when you push play, it goes ka-chunk and engages everything, but nothing moves. So I'm assuming there was a belt broken. So I watched a couple of videos on YouTube about how to replace the capstan belt on an RT909. And I said, oh my God, I don't think that's something I want to try myself. So I'm still going to probably wind up trying it myself because I haven't found anybody in the area to do it. But if you know anybody on the West Coast or at this point nationally that is really good with RT909, please let me know, because I would like to probably send it off, and it probably needs new caps and all kinds of stuff. I mean, it was surfaced before I got it, but the fact that a belt has already broken makes me question how well.
And someone else is asking, I know you've mentioned this a couple times, you have a GitHub account, so you may as well push that too.
Yeah, GitHub. So GitHub, my account's GitHub/DavePL, but the one you really want is GitHub/Plummer Software LLC. That's where all the good stuff goes. So that's where the Primes project is. That's where the official versions of Night Driver is. That's where you'll find Pet Clock and Pet Rock, the Spectrum Analyzer and the clock code. All that stuff is on GitHub/Plummer Software LLC. No apostrophe.
How do you feel about people moving from using the term program to using the term application?
Well, I think application is a specialization of program, because the operating system counts as a program, but it's not an application. So application is user code, I guess. That's how I always thought of it.
You think it's still a good idea to learn C in 2022?
Yes, I do.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't know if it should be your first language, of course. I would probably start with Python and work your way up, but once you get comfortable in that, I think learning C is a great thing. So,
what version of Visual Studio you like the best, and why?
I have moved pretty much to Visual Studio Code from Visual Studio. I did some stuff in Visual Studio as recently as like 6 months ago because they had debugging of the Raspberry Pi remotely, but now Visual Studio Code has all that too. It's lighter weight, it works on the Mac, and it works under Linux, and I can jump around from machine to machine, and I can list wherever and build, and Platform I/O makes it really easy on the ESP32, and so I'm pretty much a Visual Studio Code 100% guy right now. One of the questions I've had lately is, when are you going to do an episode on Hypercache, which is a piece of software that I wrote before Microsoft, actually in college. It is how I put myself through college, and I got a couple copies here. We've got Hypercache version 1, let's see. As you can see, professionally produced in CorelDRAW, only the best. And then we have version 2, came along a couple years later, with a better logo and 2 colors now. So what was it? Oh, well, let me tell you the marketing spiel, because that's the best part here. Let's see. Hypercache Pro is an N-way associative look-ahead cache system for any block-accessible device. It employs a method of cache preservation known as the LRU algorithm, normally used on mini and mainframe computers in high-performance virtual memory systems. Apart from its unique ability to arbitrate among cached information blocks, it also performs an intelligent sector prefetch that can bring your data into memory even before you request it. All true, but also pretty standard for caching software these days. But at the time, there was no caching on the Amiga at all. They had you could set buffers for floppies, which gave you a little bit of caching of the directory structure of the floppy itself, I believe. But at the time I wrote this, the original one, there was no caching at all, especially for hard drives and any device other than floppy. So it was really terrible. And what I wound up doing was looking for a sample to start with. And the only thing I could find was a device driver hook that went in, and then I think it prevented you from writing to the disk. So it was like a write protect thing. So it would hook the driver, and if you tried to write, it would just fail. So I took that code and I was like, okay, now I know how to hook a driver. And I started there. And I wrote the standard cache algorithm and everything else. And it was actually pretty easy to interface with the system, because if you think about it, you're going to get a block request. So go get me disk 1 and get me block 3000 off of that disk. Well, you can take those two numbers and look it up in your cache and say, hey, did you save block 3000 for device 1? And if you did, return it. And if not, prefetch it. Or not prefetch it, fetch it. And when you go to fetch number 3000, you might as well grab 3001 and 3002 and 3003 and so on, because odds are those are going to be your next requests. If it's highly random read patterns, you're going to actually make things worse, but that's not usually how I/O works. So prefetch usually helps a fair bit. The other thing it did was being an N-way associative cache, which means instead of just saying we're going to hash your block number into one number and look it up in a table, it could do that in any number of dimensions. And I think 3 was actually pretty good, because you have sectors, tracks, and cylinders. Whether that physical mapping maps to the actual structure of the cache or not is up to how you configure it. But if you do that, I found that turned in pretty good performance. I wrote a program called SPS Transfer, which is kind of like the Blackmagic disk transfer program on the Mac, if you've seen that with the 2 meters. I should write one of those for the PC, because they're handy. But I did write one for the Amiga, and I forget what the marketing claim was here. It was like 22 times faster. Here we go. Oh, it's a disk speed. Megabytes per second. Stock A1200 is like 200 megabytes per second. And then out of the cache, it was about 7,000.
Looks like we only got left audio.
Yeah, it would probably take me 10 minutes to figure out the UI on the Sony camera to go through there and say, oh my God, there's like 15 different menus. All right, so anyway, I wrote this cache, and I decided I'm going to release it as shareware. And I decided, no, I'm not. I'm going to release it commercially. And so that's why I went out and had these awesome little manuals and all that printed up at the school print lab. I went with my girlfriend, and I took my CorelDRAW files in a Word document, and then we got them all printed up and stapled, and then we took them to some other weird industrial place and shrink wrapped them by hand, each one, and made a couple dozen, and hoped that somebody would buy it and send out copies to distributors and magazines and so on. And then one day when I was sitting in the school bar for lunch, not drinking, just eating, we got a call, and I got an order of my first batch of 50 from Safe Harbor, I believe was the software company, if you remember them in the back of Amiga magazines. So they were the first ones to ever carry it. And so from that order of 50, it just occasionally everybody started carrying it, and you could find it in retail stores. It was in my hometown, and it was nice to see. So unfortunately, we're going to have some shitty audio for now, unfortunately. But look at the picture quality. I mean, it's amazing. 1440p live on YouTube. You can't ask for more, except maybe audio. All right. Oh, so we printed up a bunch of these ones, shipped them off, and I sold, 50 at a time here and there to various distributors, and that's actually how I put myself through college and paid for my wife's wedding ring and afforded to get married and moved to the U.S. and everything else.
When did you know you wanted a career in computers, Dave?
It's kind of it's a funny story. Well, not really a funny story, but I knew that I was fascinated with computers from like the age of 10 or 12 when I saw my very first one. Walked into a Radio Shack, they had the boxes there, and I helped them set it up, and I typed some nonsense in, hit enter, and it said SN error, which I assume meant spelling error, but it's of course syntax error. And I was just flabbergasted and blown away, and I wanted to spend all my time with that machine and do nothing else. Kind of like when I was 6 and I went to a laundromat and I had a pinball machine, and I was like, must bond. But I've known all of my life that I was really fascinated by computers and technology, but I remember being in college and being like, I'm not sure what I'm going to do when I graduate. Am I going to write the code that blinks to 12 on a VCR somewhere? Am I going to go work at the wheat pool and count bushels of wheat coming in on the train? Or what the hell am I going to do? And then I wound up at Microsoft because I wrote this cache software, and guy who bought this here, maybe it's a good place to tie it up and leave it at that.
There you go.
I had this software. I was writing in college, and I read a book called Bill Gates' Hard Drive and the Making of Microsoft, something like that. Hard Drive, I think is the name of the title. Great book. And I knew that I wanted to be there. I mean, the stories of what they were doing and everything else they were describing was like my ideal environment. And so I kind of made it my mission, my special interest to work there. And I went through every registration I had of Hypercache looking for anybody with a Microsoft.com address. And I found one guy, Alistair Banks, and sent him an email and said, hey, my name is Dave, and I wrote some cache software, and I want to be an intern at Microsoft because I had 1 year of college left. What do I do? And he forwarded it around to a couple guys internally, and then they wound up calling me, and Ben Slivka did a phone interview with me, and I came out, interviewed, and long story short, wound up in MS-DOS. So if not for the cache software, I would not have wound up in DOS because I was working on Smart Drive and added the CD-ROM caching to MS-DOS 622. So with that, I don't know how the audio is. I got to go back and watch this whole live stream and see how it works because this is the first one I've done in like 2 years, I think, or something. So, or almost. We've done like maybe one before.
Yeah, but not with someone else sitting here.
Yeah. So
I think it's my fault.
We'll blame Glenn. He's the audio problem. See, no, I have it set up for an interview situation right now, and so you wanted it kind of separate, but I guess having me out of one side doesn't work that well. All right. Well, thanks for joining me. In the meantime and in between time, hope to see you next time, right here in Dave's Garage. And now I'm going to fumble around and try to find the stop streaming button as you stare at me.